Thank you everyone for joining the Charter School Subcommittee meeting. I'm going to hand it over to our chair to kick us off this morning.
Hey all, I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you, Tess, for opening us up here. Nate, Gordon, I hope you're doing well. Hello from Nashville.
Hello.
Good to get you all on the line. I'm excited to sit down here and chat about some very big, important topics around our LEA authorizer fee reporting and the authorizer valuation development. I'm going to go ahead and very quickly turn it over to Tess Stovall. Tess, we're eager to jump in. The floor is yours to launch us and get us started on the conversation.
Great. And just a quick reminder that if you are not talking, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, just so that we can make sure that everyone can hear us, and then we will make sure to pause when we open it up to this discussion to give you an opportunity to unmute. So as we shared, the agenda for today is that we're first going to recognize the State Board School District Teacher of the Year. We are excited to be able to have someone to recognize within our 3 schools, as well as to recommend them to the statewide Teacher of the Year. We're going to talk about the fiscal year 19 LEA authorizer fee reporting, and we have Dr. Robert Lundeen from the Tennessee Department of Education who's joined us for that part of the conversation. Then we are going to discuss the authorizer evaluation development work that we've been doing, and we have David Hartman from Schoolworks who's going to be joining us for that conversation. And then the last thing, I'm going to do a quick update to the subcommittee on the work of the Tennessee Charter School Commission and how the state board has been supporting that work thus far and what that's going to look like over the next couple of months. So first up, we have the recognition of the Teacher of the Year, and Allie Gaffey on the state board team is going to share the information about this wonderful teacher.
Thanks, Tess. Good morning, everyone. So we at the State Board are really excited to announce our district's first ever Teacher of the Year, Ms. Shauna Bissonette. Ms. Bissonette teaches 10th grade geometry at Bluff City High School in Memphis, Tennessee, and is known among her colleagues as a solutions-oriented team player. This is her 2nd year at the school, and in just a short amount of time, she's become a true leader among her peers. Additionally, she has led her students through great gains in mathematics on internal and state assessments. And we just wanted to take a moment to congratulate her on this honor and are pleased to know that her students have a great teacher who shows up for them every single day. So congratulations, Shauna, and best of luck as you continue through the process of being nominated for the Teacher of the Year across the state. Turn it back over to Tess.
Hey, Alice, is Gordon. Can you tell me, I'm just curious to know, who makes the decision on these kind of awards? Is there a committee that reviews, and how many folks were kind of considered for this?
Yeah, great question. So our district is a little unique, as you know, and so our process is slightly different than the larger districts across the state. But for us, the Teacher of the Year was selected or nominated by the school leaders, and you can actually, as a district, nominate a Teacher of the Year per grade band. So you have the K-5, 6 through 8, and 9 to 12. So actually all 3 of our schools were eligible, and we could have nominated 3 teachers. But there are specific criteria involved per the department for who can actually be eligible. And so we were a little bit limited, being that we're a pretty new district in terms of who we can nominate. But Bluff City, our high school that's been in operation for 3 years, had the most people eligible. And so their leadership team is the one that selected Shauna. And from here, we recommend her as the representative from our district, which then goes on to multiple step process of moving through at a regional level and then kind of getting into the 3 grand divisions at the state level in that competition essentially across the state.
Okay, well, thanks for that clarification.
Sure.
Thanks, Allie. So the next up on our agenda is the first real meaty part of this conversation today, which is on the FY19 LEA authorizer fee reporting. I sent the board members some background materials, and so on the webinar today, I'm going to give a brief overview of the authorizer fee and the reporting requirements. Then we're going to have Dr. Lundeen share a little bit from the Department of Education regarding what the process looks like this year, and then we're going to dive into a deeper discussion about these reports. If you're a member of the public who is listening in online, the LEA authorizer fee reports are available currently on the state board's website. So as background and context for everyone regarding the authorizer fee that LEAs or school districts can collect, this comes from statute, which is Tennessee Code Annotated 4913-128, which allows local boards of education to collect an annual authorizer fee of the lesser of 3% of an annual per student and local allocations, which is basically the BEP, or $35,000 per school. And you will see a part of the reporting template, districts were asked whether or not they were collecting $35,000 a school or that 3%, particularly in schools that are just starting out, and so they have a smaller BEP amount, they would be hitting that 3% limit. The state board then adopted a rule that lays out the allowable uses of the authorizer fee for local boards of education. We went through a very long promulgation process to develop this rule and talked with many stakeholders as a part of this process to determine how best could we write this rule so that it provided transparency for authorizer fee usage, but also provided additional resources to authorizers to have quality authorizing in their local districts. The state board rule states that funds shall be used exclusively for fulfilling authorizer obligations. So this would include the approval process of applications, monitoring and oversight that is occurring during the charter term, and the renewal process. So really covering that 10-year charter term that a charter school is under that district. We did put in that the authorizer fee could fund personnel costs supporting charter schools, but our state board rule does say those have to be above and beyond the scope and capacity of the LEA duties. So one thing that we'll get into in a few minutes is that we did see personnel costs specifically around charter school office staff being paid for via the authorizer fee, as well as some traditional LEA staff being tied to the authorizer fee. In state law, local boards of education must annually report out to the Tennessee Department of Education by December the 1st of every year a detailed use of the authorizer fee. This is mirrored in state board rule, and this also is, although the state board authorizer fee is not under this statute necessarily, we also have in our other section of the statute have to annually report out by December 1st the state board's uses of our authorizer fee. And for context purposes, I shared that authorizer fee report with you all, as well as that is publicly posted on the state board's website. So in fiscal year 19, which was school year 18-19, the following local boards of education collected an authorizer fee, and these are the reports that we have posted on our website. We have Metro Nashville Public Schools, we have Shelby County Schools, we have Hamilton County Schools, and we have Knox County Schools. And before we get into the discussion questions, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Robert Lundeen from the Tennessee Department of Education for him to share briefly about what the reporting process has looked like thus far in this year, and any kind of top line questions that he got from districts before we dive into the discussion. So Robert?
Good morning, everybody. And I know I'm the only one on camera, but it's because I know I'm the only one that is the new face in the bunch. So I'll turn my lens off in a few minutes. My name is Robert Lundeen, and I have the privilege of serving as Assistant Commissioner for School Models and Programs at the Tennessee Department of Ed. We are a division that was established this summer. We are charged with expanding access to high-quality school options regardless of geography or sector. So that includes charter schools, private school choice, virtual schools, and non-public schools. So when we received the word about the new rule promulgated by the state board, we at the department were very excited by this. We also knew that it was going to be a bit of a experimental year when it comes to the degree of clarity and candor that we were going to get in the reporting process. When we were first notified of the rule, and I and my team reached out to our counterparts at State Board, Sarah and Tess, to discuss what the right level of detail would look like that didn't overwhelm LEAs in terms of reporting, but that did get into the degree of specificity we needed to see to ensure that authorizer fee money was getting back in some way, shape, or form to serving kids that it was intended for. And so the documents that you see posted were the result of a bit of brainstorming around how how LEAs could go about delineating specific expenditures within each of the 7 allowed categories under the rule. Tess also flagged the fact that this is more than just a district responsibility to make sure that funds are being spent appropriately when they're charter fees, but it's also up to boards. And so you'll notice within this document that it requires the signature of the superintendent, the board chair, and the CFO, and that it is going to be a transparent document as well as one that will enlist further clarification. Part of the rule says that in the event that the Department of Ed finds that the funds have not been utilized in the way that they were intended to be when the fee was offered in the first place, that the department has the authority to redirect funds at the same and equal level. I think top-line headlines, what we noticed in the initial reports was, one, a fair amount of confusion on the part of LEAs in terms of, am I reporting for a fiscal year? Am I reporting for a school year? How am I delineating specific staff functions or departmental functions just so there's specific links to the charter campuses we oversee? Secondly, there are some gaps in terms of the correlation between both the figures that are quoted and the purposes that are cited. And so what comes next is charged under the rule for the department to do is my team follows up with the respective districts and requests further information to ascertain specifically how those funds are being spent in a manner that is appropriate, so that we make a determination if any sort of redirection is required, and so that we can hone the way that we structure this reporting process in the future. I think more than anything, I think this is a level-setting year when it comes to the degree of visibility that we're going to expect when it comes to not only how fees are being assessed, but what they're being used for, and the specific link to demonstrated needs within the charter schools they support. I'll turn it back over to Tess.
Thank you, Robert. So now we are going to turn to the discussion questions that we have developed for the board members. And certainly, board members, we are welcome to go in whatever direction you all want to go based on your review of the report. But the first question that we would like to pose to the group and get some initial thoughts on is that several districts allocated funds across various different district offices supporting the work of charter schools. And one question that I would like to hear from you all is, what additional information would you like collected from districts in the future about this work so that we can determine allowability of these funds and the use of these funds? I think we are trying to balance transparency without creating work for work purposes, but I do want to make sure that we are collecting the appropriate information that allows us to determine allowability. So Nate, Gordon, and Elisa, if you all want to go ahead and unmute yourself for this discussion and share out any of your thoughts that you might have.
Ms. Gordon, just if I'm understanding correctly, you've given us a breakdown of what the uses of the funds were for, I guess, fiscal year 2019. So that I think it totaled about 82,000. Am I?
So that's for the state board's authorizer fee reporting. The district's authorizer fee reporting the total amount varies depending on how many charter schools that they have.
Okay. So would it be fair to say, are the funds being used to support additional personnel to carry out the function, or I'm just trying to get a benchmark of kind of in general what the breakdown of the funds include?
Sure, and I think this does depend on what we saw when we looked at the reports. Is it does depend on the amount of funds and the number of charter schools that a district has. So if you take, for example, Knox County, which is a district that only has one charter school, so they only collected $35,000. You can see that they have split their funds across various processes such as interim review, annual reporting, and oversight and monitoring activities. We don't have more specific details within this report about what those activities actually are. So I think a potential question back to Knox County would be, can you provide us additional detail about, for example, what are those oversight and monitoring activities or those ongoing support services that were being provided with these funds? When you look at a larger district such as Shelby County or Metro Nashville, they were collecting a significant amount of funds in the authorizer fee because they do have so many charter schools. So, for example, Shelby County collected a little over $1.7 million in an authorizer fee. So they are paying for some direct personnel for those via those funds, as well as splitting out across various departments the funds usage.
Okay, thanks, Tess.
So this is Nate. A couple questions. Like I'm looking here at so when you're looking at the Shelby County schools and the metro schools, when they're looking at, there's a handwritten stuff in on the metro. Well, one, I just say it'd be good to have them all typed, I guess. The questions I have are like, there's $432,000 of annual reporting costs. There's $93,000 going to MNPS Office of Director of Schools, MNPS Board of Education, $72,000. What does that $100,000 go to? Is that something it seems pretty generic to say it's going to the $100,000 is going to the Office of the Director. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get too granular, but that sort of I guess when you look at the example we gave, it's saying hourly staff time devoted to review of annual charter school performance, and then what they're writing down is just, Office of the Director or Board of Education. I'm curious as to what, it doesn't seem clear of what they're spending that on. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you look over at Shelby County on some of theirs is, I'm looking for the page, their annual reporting page for some reason. Where's that? Oh yeah, they have $13,000 in annual reporting. Mm. So it's just looking at, that's a pretty large, Shelby County is pretty large. I'm looking at the right one. They're spending $13,000 on annual reporting, and Metro is spending $432,000 on annual reporting. Mm-hmm. And I guess, what percentage of their overall collection is that to try to get, instead of just the raw numbers, like what are the percentages there?
I agree, Nate. And when I'm looking at Shelby County's report under 5D, under oversight and monitoring, I do actually like some of the specificity that Shelby County has provided here with regard to how they're breaking down those oversight and monitoring activities.
Yeah, 5D is fantastic.
Yeah, I think that there are some areas where I would want maybe a couple more sentences of like what that looks like, but to me that gives me a really clear overall picture of the various places that charter schools are, where are these funds being used. And I think if I'm a charter school, I would be able to look at some of these line items to determine how my school is impacted. I agree that on some of the other reports, it's far too high level for me as a charter school to determine how that actually impacts me.
Okay.
So the next question that I wanted to pose to the group is specifically around the question of personnel. And we do have districts that are charging personnel to the authorizer fee. And we do recognize that quality authorizing does take capacity. But would be curious to know if you all would like to see moving forward a short job description of what those personnel are doing, or anything more additional there so that we can make sure that they are aligning their work to quality authorizing.
Yes, that strikes me, yes, as a baseline good solution. Presumably they have that sketched out anyway in order to direct their staff accordingly. So that seems to me not a burden. I mean, this bleeds into the answer to the previous question, but I don't know how else to put this, but a lot of this just doesn't meet the sense check. Like, so for example, like the 100,000, to the directors, I mean, that presumes that, I don't know, I don't know what the total budget is of that office, but let's say it's 400,000, which I think is aggressive. But maybe not, but let's assume it's 400,000. That would assume that 25% of that person's time is spent only on authorizing. It just doesn't meet a sense check. And so there's got to be some way, if I understand this correctly. So there has to be some way to also force the common sense check up front. Like, this is a percent of this is, or, contextualizing some of the numbers so that whoever's putting together the report is forced to reckon up front with common sense. And then, right, if that doesn't meet the sniff test, then I do want lots of detail. I find process generally, for the sake of process, terribly onerous, and I would like to avoid it. But also, I don't want to be fed things that just don't even meet a basic sense check, where it clearly is just, to me anyway, on the face of it, just pulled out of somewhere. And there's no sort of, calculus behind it. And so if we must, then we need to demand the calculus behind it. I think it's an open question as to how that calculus is done in a way that, again, is not onerous, but I feel quite unsettled about even to the around the first question and how we're sort of proceeding on that front in a super transparent way that stands up to all kinds of courts of reason, including ours, as well as the charter schools, as well as the general public.
Thank you, Lisa, and I do think that leads into the next question is around report review process should occur after these reports are submitted. And Robert, if you don't mind, I would love for you to hear kind of what your initial thoughts here on how you're planning to do some initial reviews, and then from board members, if you all have any additional thoughts about what the review process should look like moving forward.
Thanks, Tess, and I want to echo some of the thoughts that the committee members have shared in terms of we don't want the process to be onerous, but we do want it to be real in terms of real demonstration of where funds are being directed to serve kids And Elisa, to your point, it's got to pass the smell test. And I think, at least from my perspective, and my boss I know is also on the call, our Chief District and Schools Officer is here as well, and we talked a bit about it, is the idea that the next step is going to need to be a series of clarifying questions regarding what is entailed in some of the items that are listed there and the extent to which those services are being delivered exclusively, partly, at all to charters. To Elisa's point earlier, if it's simply listing a job title or listing a general function and slapping a number down there, one, there's got to be a methodology by which that number was calculated, and it's important to know how we got there. And two, to the point that we mentioned earlier, if we are asking a superintendent, a CFO, and a board chair to sign off on this document and say we validate the fact that funds intended to be used for this purpose are going that direction, and we're not sure based on that first blush report that it's actually going to get there, I think initiating a series of more clarifying questions that would allow for a more detailed reporting of the expenditures is appropriate there.
So, Robert, like there's a few different ways that, and I don't know if we want to get down to this level of detail, but, I am eager to get clarity here because some of the numbers make so little sense to me that I'm sort of astonished. And so, simply put, and so it suggests that we are not at all aligned across districts, us, et cetera. And so maybe we just need to be highly directive. So, I could imagine like a list of questions that whoever's putting this initial report together has to, it's a checklist of questions you go through. Number one, as a percent of the overall budget of this person, what does this represent? To my like director's office example. Because, if you're claiming that X is like 25% of the overall budget, that needs to be proven out then on calendars, which are all foilable. And so really, is it really 25%? Because that doesn't, you're going to get pressed, to prove that then if it's that off, or it's just like a series of like, just go through and sense check this and make sure that it is provable, supportable. Again, and Tess, I don't know if this is the time and place to go through all this level of detail or how we should leave it, or maybe what we should do is, someone goes offline and proposes an approach that we can then review and then give feedback on so that we get the proper balance. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking is that what I would like is that because the state board rule does put the responsibility in the Department of Education to determine ultimate allowability, Robert, if it works for you, I think your team taking the first crack of like, what does this follow-up look like? And you obviously the state board are willing and able partners here, but once I think we have something that we can get the subcommittee feedback on, that we could share that out via email for feedback before we would go back to districts with additional questions. Robert, does that work for you?
I'm sorry?
Does that work for you?
Yeah, it works for me.
Board members, does that feel like a reasonable approach for you all as well?
Yeah.
Yes, that works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then the last couple questions, which we've touched on a little bit, but I do want to make sure that as we know that this is an iterative process, and anytime you do something for the first time, you learn a lot, and we know what we want to do moving forward. And we've called out a number of, I think, changes that we would want to make to the reporting structure for FY20. I've heard Nate's request for everything to be typed out rather than written out, and I agree. But anything top line for you all after reviewing these reports in terms of the template that you would like to call out? And I do think there's an opportunity for us to, once we make these changes moving forward, for us to get feedback on the template from the subcommittee prior to sharing it out with districts for FY20 reporting, just to make sure that we are aligned on what are we asking districts to be completing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
But anything else that you all would like to call out on the template itself?
Well, yeah, so just, it's a little bit like Lisa said. If there was a place to put even percentage of budget as a fill-in category at the end, so when you look, and everybody down at the bottom where it says total annual authorized or funds spent in category 5F, I know it might be hard to say, here's what your target percentage is, kind of budgeting on the front end, but at least on the back end for, as you're reviewing it, to have each district sort of just divide their total of each category by the total spent, where you're at least seeing the big buckets of percentage spent, which would give you a good sense based on the different sizes, different, gross amount, different budget sizes from the different size districts. That would really create an interesting and somewhat simple picture in the review process of, is this 30% of your budget? Is this 50% of your budget? Is this what? And then you can kind of line those up and saying what district's spending what percent where. Then when that would highlight initial discrepancies that you may want to press into further without creating more work. Or a lot more work. That was just a suggestion.
No, I think that's great. And I think what I would like to see is maybe there's a column where we force in a few more sentences around a description, because I think there are some line items that I think could be easily explained, such that we would feel satisfied on the transparency. But I think it's hard when it's just the title of the office to really get clarity around what that's being spent for. And so even if it's just on the front end, in addition to a percentage, it's a short description of this cost so that we know where we need to press further.
Yeah, the other suggestion is to force more somehow through the template the articulation of actual deliverables. So I think that is legitimately harder in something like the director's office, because I could imagine like the director's not producing anything. It's like discussion. It's just time on the task. However, for something like reporting, if someone is saying that 50% of someone's role, I'm obviously making this up as an example, but like let's say it's, the allocation 50%. It's spent on, quote, reporting. I'm legitimately interested in what those deliverables are. Because part of this also is just norming, right? Like, I'm assuming everyone is a good actor. And the question is just like, what, the fascinating thing between Memphis and Nashville is, like, in terms of the discrepancies is, okay, well then, let's assume for a second both are doing what they're doing, and those are accurate, truly accurate time representations of what's happening. That begs lots of questions about operational excellence. Like, is it that Memphis is just not doing enough, or is it that Nashville is doing way too much? And, I'm interested in those questions as well. It's not just about accountabilities. It's also about operational excellence. And so, in an ideal world, and maybe this is dreamland, but like the districts are looking at each other and saying, oh, well, how are you only spending this and we're spending this? Because we could do less, or we could do more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you're spending $432,000 on reporting and you handwrite and white out a report, it brings up a question.
Correct. And so I do think, like, sort of being forced to reckon up front with just the deliverables, like what came out of that $400,000 spend, should be somehow, pushed on that form, so that gets back to the checklist idea, though. Also, Excel would be, I think, anything that's got like cells and checks and whatnot. Arguably, Excel is a better format.
Great. Robert, did you have any follow-up questions on that topic that you wanted clarity on with the members?
No, this feedback is terrific. And to Tessa's point earlier, we will follow up with this committee in writing with some initial thoughts before we undertake any next steps. You'll either be hearing from me or from our new director of charter schools, Judy Spencer. Judy, are you on the call? Not sure if Judy's around. But she is going to be the chief point person on many aspects of this work, and so we'll be tag teaming a bit. But we will coordinate with Tess and Allie and get the next iteration of this in front of y'all before we move forward. Thank you all for the feedback.
Great, thank you. And the last question is really just to make sure that we have in the back of our heads before we move into the next part of our discussion that we don't want the authorizer fee use and reporting to live in isolation, especially as we ramp up our work on authorizer evaluations. And that our hope is that we do think of these two pieces as kind of two pieces of the same pie, because what we are hoping is that we're driving authorizer quality via the use of the authorizer fee to drive what we're going to be evaluating moving forward. And so no need for the group to respond on the last question, but I did want to make sure that we had a really nice segue into our authorizer evaluation development, and that we are putting aside usage of BEP funds for authorizers to use, and so we want to make sure that these things are closely aligned. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining the call. We really appreciate it, and I know that the subcommittee members look forward to hearing from you further. And so you're welcome to drop off. You're also welcome to stay on if you want to hear more. But at this point, I'm going to
listen for a bit. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you.
And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Allie Gaffey, to lead this part of the conversation.
Thanks, Tess. Okay, so perfect transition here. Talking about the authorizer evaluation fee, the authorizer fee leading into the evaluation development that we've been working on. We also have David Hartman joining us. I'll introduce him a little bit more in a moment. But wanted to first start us off in grounding us in our statutory charge. So pursuant to TCA 4913-145, the State Board is responsible for evaluating authorizer quality through periodic evaluations in order to determine compliance. Should an authorizer fail to remedy this noncompliance, then the authorizer may face a reduction of the authorizer fees, which we were just speaking to. So currently there are 6 authorizers in our state, and the State Board shall evaluate each. At this time, that includes us, but by the time we actually start doing the evaluations, this work under the State Board will transition, the work of an authorizer will transition to the Public Charter School Commission, so they will be included in these evaluations, which will officially start in 2021. So I want to turn it over to my colleague here, David Hartman. We have partnered with him through an organization named Schoolworks, and he's been working really closely with Tess and myself to help us develop and initiate our authorizer evaluations. So he's going to provide us with a little background on authorizer evaluations and join me in leading our discussion today. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Allie. Thanks for the opportunity to have a little time with all of you, and hopefully I can give a little bit of context before we get to a couple of questions. I understand that most of you have had an opportunity to see a little bit of the background information that's summarized in the slide that we're looking at right now, but I just want to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about how you got here and nationally how we got here. So authorizer accountability is really a matter of thinking about charter schools started as this thing, and accountability was present in the law, but not necessarily acted on in the ways that we see it now today, nearly 30 years into charter schools. And so nationally, the trend has been as some charter schools have not met expectations, or folks have started to question those, that there's been a trend for authorizers to hold schools more accountable, but then be held accountable themselves. Tennessee has been proactive in adjusting, adapting, and making new policy to reflect some of these trends and holds authorizers accountable, investigate the idea of consequences for poor authorizing, and then ultimately removing low-performing authorizers. That's not necessarily your intent, but it is present and consistent with kind of the national trends of things. So I've had the opportunity through my work professionally to work across 2 of the 3 states that are implementing this, and then now Tennessee, which is the 3rd of 4 states. So I was working for the State Department of Education in Minnesota and helped and led the implementation of their evaluation process. Working with SchoolWorks, we have done the annual evaluation of what they call sponsors, but authorizers in Ohio for the last 5 years. Now we're going into our 6th round of that. And so a high-level takeaway on all of this is that their data that we've been able to pull together seems to indicate that there is a positive correlation in student outcomes that tracks consistent with implementation of authorizer accountability both in Minnesota and Ohio. So the difference between the math and reading scores in Minnesota has been not nullified, but it's been lessened over the 10 years that their authorizer evaluation process has been in place. And then similarly in Ohio, when looking at their report card grade, there's been an increase over time in the 5 years that they've implemented. Some key differences between state to state. Minnesota does an evaluation every 5 years for authorizers. Ohio does every year. So within Ohio, we've been able to see that their system based on national standards. So first off, in the first iteration of the evaluation, only less than 10% of the sponsors or authorizers that were evaluated achieved in the effective or exemplary. After the 4th round, which ended last fall, 2/3 of the remaining authorizers were scoring at an effective or exemplary. So Ohio has a lot more at-bats, and so we're able to track that change, but there's a positive trend, a significant trend based on national standards that quality has improved over time. And then academic quality has tracked or correlated positively as well. I am very cautious not to say that it's causal, but there is a correlation there as well. So in our work with the authorizers in Tennessee and with Tess and Allie and their team, we have been devising things in the characteristics that are displayed on the slide that you see in front of you now. So the emerging process that we will have a pilot that'll kick off next fall, and then the official reviews will begin the fall of 21. Like Allie said, it'll be a biannual process, so roughly 3 authorizers in Tennessee will be evaluated by the state board each year. It's focused on continuous improvement and aligns to the discussion that preceded this. So it's aimed to hold authorizers accountable to the fees that they spend for their work. The initial engagement, so what that's about is basically how many folks or the volume of voices that have been involved in the process. So we've convened a state group or a stakeholder group task force and many different focus groups to collect perspectives. I believe some of you who are on this call have participated in some of those calls with me back in October or November. So thank you for your contributions there. What's resulting is an evaluation process that has internal and external evaluators. So primarily the state board staff will conduct the evaluations. However, the design that we've come up with will add one authorizer to each evaluation team, one to give external perspective and also to basically work as a professional development opportunity so they can see what the process is, what another authorizer looks like, and kind of norm to the expectations that the state board is expressing through this process. Ultimately, and this is kind of teed up for this conversation to kind of start to consider, are how can fees be reduced if there is ineffective performance that's identified through it. And so we aim to kind of help facilitate some of that conversation. Before we kind of move on to Allie's next slide here, I just want to pause for a second to see if there are any specific questions on any of this kind of fire hose of information that I just laid out in front of you.
I have none.
Oh.
All right. Thanks. Allie?
Great. Thanks, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
So moving forward, thinking about our implementation timeline, board members, you've seen this slide before, but wanted to remind you of our timeline here. So we're planning to bring our authorizer evaluation rule on first reading at our July meeting to begin a pilot evaluation this fall. We will then make updates to the rule based on the pilot and bring that to you in February, and then officially begin our first evaluation cycle in the fall of 2021. So before we move further, any questions about our expected timeline here?
I'm good.
Okay, so move us into our topics for discussion. So we want to spend some time discussing 3 specific topics that our team has been wrestling with regarding our authorizer evaluations. The first is with regard to intervention options, both positive and negative for authorizers. We've been taking guidance from Ohio and Minnesota, as Dave was just talking you through, while also staying within what's allowed in statute. And we've comprised a list of possible interventions based on an authorizer's evaluation rating. So before we dig into those options, I'd like to start with the evaluation ratings we're planning to use. And Dave, I'm going to hand this back over to you. Can you talk briefly through how Minnesota and Ohio have structured their overall ratings and scoring?
Yep. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward what you see where the cuts are between satisfactory and effective are, a little bit different. And the idea to have 5 rather than 4 bands of ratings basically give more opportunities to get specific. So some of our original conversations were to have 3 bands, but really what we found as we kind of teased it out and played with what was developing was that most would fall into the middle band, and so that would not give you or the staff really good perspective on who is making progress or really the quality and differentiating, giving some clear perspective on things. The other thing to note is Minnesota and Ohio. Minnesota's is based on the quality review in a singular sense, which is exactly what we're doing here in Tennessee. The Ohio overall rating actually is based on 3 things. So it's based on the quality evaluation, which is similar to what we're doing, and then a compliance review and a review of the academic outcomes. So there are 3 ratings that make up the overall rating that in turn have consequences in Ohio. So maybe move on to the next. So yes, this is what we are recommending is a 5-band overall rating system. We have not put in scores quite deliberately because we don't know where they're going to suss out, and that's why we're running a pilot next fall across 2 or 3 of the authorizers. And so we will work together to come up with some recommendations about where those bands are and where the cuts are in terms of the scores or the percentages of achieving the standards from one to the next. And just to kind of actually, Allie, if you could go back to the previous one, those scores in Ohio have evolved over the years. So it hasn't been dramatic, but we've seen that they have been smart about adjusting and making sure to reflect the field and then push. So in other words, over time, the standard has actually gotten higher. What it means to achieve effective and or exemplary has nudged higher each year. And that, from all I can tell, is not political so much as just a graduated process of expectations as the sponsors get better perspective on what the expectations are and how to fulfill them. And so it increases quality over time. You can go back to the next one, Allie. So that's my part on that. Allie, I think you have the next.
Yes, great. Any questions here?
Alex, this Gordon, just so I'm understanding, for Tennessee, are these set up, the evaluations biannually? Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. So we'll move into our first topic for discussion. These are intervention options. So with each of the possible evaluation ratings, we've comprised a list of possible options to discuss with you today. So we'll walk through these briefly and then open it up to you all to discuss where we're falling with these options. So the first category being exemplary, we definitely wanted to make sure that we are highlighting the authorizers that achieve this, public recognition, sharing best practices, they can learn from one another, potentially the idea of exemption from the next evaluation cycle, or no set amount of for the number of schools required for documentation. We have that in place right now, and perhaps instead of, you're required to submit for 2 different schools for each category, there is not a set amount. We've also talked about the potential of the elimination of select standards and then submitting in their off-year narrative without additional documentation, and we'll talk through that more in a moment. But then moving forward, commendable, having a lot of similar pieces, just cutting out a few of them. Satisfactory, requiring them to submit documentation for any standards that they received a 0 and 1 evaluation ratings in off-year narratives. For authorizers who score approaching satisfactory, submitting a corrective action plan and then updating the state board via their annual report on the progress towards that plan. And if no progress is made, that they may be subject to a reduction in the authorizer fee. And then finally, with the unsatisfactory incomplete, potentially monitoring them again the next year, having them submit a corrective action plan as well. And if they were to have a repeat rating of unsatisfactory or incomplete, then they would then be subject to the reduction in authorizer. So our question here is around what we would like to keep, change, add, or remove. But before we talk about that, I want to mention we're beginning with this topic of intervention because we really need your feedback on it, given that we determine the interventions, whatever we determine here will need to be included in our rule, which we'll have on first read in July. So although we'll wait until the conclusion of the pilot, as Dave mentioned, to determine the rating threshold, we can set these interventions now. I also want to point out that we would like to ensure that any authorizer who receives a 0 or 1 overall rating for a standard would be disqualified from receiving exemplary rating. We thought that was an important distinction to make. And so considering all that we have proposed here, curious your thoughts, would love to open it up for discussion on interventions that you think we should keep, change, add, remove, any other questions as well.
And Allie, you might want to go to the previous slide if you're thinking about specific interventions. Yeah, there you go.
One question is on for unsatisfactory and incomplete. Just out of curiosity, like did you all consider things that were more extreme on either end? And maybe this gets to both the unsatisfactory and the exemplary. So you have like two extremes, right? And like, what is the best thing we could possibly do for those who are exemplary, and what is the harshest thing that we could do on the unsatisfactory? Do you feel like both those are reflected currently somewhere in here, as in the best thing and the harshest?
Yeah, I think that's what we're definitely trying to achieve here, thinking about, again, what we have the ability to do in statute, and then taking some notes from what the other states are doing. So we definitely think that because it's a biannual process, if you're achieving unsatisfactory or incomplete, being monitored again the next year is a pretty significant change or consequence, if you will, versus if you're looking at exemplary, having potentially the exemption from the next evaluation cycle, something that we were talking about. So we were trying to split that, as you were saying, Elisa, but definitely open to any other suggestions as well.
Okay, I assumed as much. I wanted to confirm. Starting with the exemplary bucket, public recognition, sharing best practices, exemption sound to me like the right set of things. Like I would do, that's in terms of exemption versus elimination of select standards, I would just pick one. I'm inclined to just say exemption. Not do any submitting of off-year narrative without it. Yeah, I would just keep it simple. Commendable seems right to me. Let me come back to satisfactory and approaching satisfactory and just go first to unsatisfactory. I do agree that monitored again the next year is the right intervention, as well as submitting a corrective action plan. I don't know if it's necessary to articulate what the reduction would be if there's a repeat rating, but it may be worth it to articulate specifically, like how harsh is that penalty? And also just thinking through, like, okay, what does happen if it's repeat? The reason I ask this sort of like, okay, is this the best worst question, is because it's not clear to me that the reduction of the fee, I realize that's a clear lever. I don't know if that's the proper intervention to actually get a better outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I recognize that in statute, maybe this is the best we can do. I mean, that's the leverage we have, but just to call that out, like if we're trying to address a root cause for why someone or, an authorizer is not, is unsatisfactory, like that does not strike me as the proper intervention to address the real problem, which then begs the question, okay, so if we're starting with root causes and we want to address the root causes appropriately and actually get to operational excellence, then I would think that unsatisfactory and incomplete requires a review of their actual processes, mandated best practices sharing with someone who is exemplary, or a sit down with someone on our staff that actually walks them through, okay, like what are you doing? Like what's something which is actually going to address the core problem, which I recognize is much messier than what we have here, and therefore in some ways operationally unideal. In terms of the satisfactory and approaching satisfactory, I didn't have strong, I don't have particularly strong reactions to this. That's it on my end.
Yep.
Is it all right if I just give a little perspective from Ohio, very specifically what their policy, no, this is written into statute, and while I don't know your statute, through and through, I do know that it's not as explicit relative to what you're expressing right here, But over the course of the 5 years, there's been evolution in state statute. There's been a change that the authorizers advocated for. So they have a 4-point scale on the overall. So if a sponsor authorizer achieves effective or exemplary for 2 of the last 3 years, then they are exempted from the process for 2 years. So that just is going into effect this particular cycle. So it contracted the total number of sponsors to be reviewed from 25 to 7 because so many of them have basically gravitated to the mean, to the expectation. The other side of the coin is poor. So if 2 of 3 years there's persistent, there is an intervention where there is a corrective action plan. So that is spelled out in policy for the sponsors who do not achieve. They need to submit a corrective action plan on an annual basis if they're below a certain level. But there have been sponsors, authorizers who have lost the ability after 3 years of not getting out of poor. And many of them voluntarily get out of the process through that process. I mean, they just know that they're not going to achieve that. They haven't allocated the will or the money toward it. But others, it's just been by follow through on the statute. So it is more spelled out in Ohio law than on the extreme ends.
And Elisa, to your point, you're exactly correct in that we are somewhat limited by statute here in what we can do. But at the same time, we've had a lot of conversation around how do we make the change actually happen. That's not the goal. Reduction of authorizer fee, okay. But what we really want is to see improved outcomes. And so that is another one of the topics for discussion here and thinking about what is our role or what can our role be in terms of sitting down with authorizers, giving them additional feedback, et cetera. So we will talk about that in a moment, but you're absolutely correct, and that is something that we have discussed many times. Other thoughts here, Gordon, Nate?
Just to build on what Lisa said, on if you have an entity that just year after year they keep missing the mark and are unsatisfactory, do you just keep reducing that fee, or where would that go? How far would that go in terms of trying to get resolution to addressing deficiencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways that's up to us to decide.
Mm-hmm.
Not a real clear answer there.
And Gordon, this is Tess. I think one of the things that we're going to be exploring is, is it a graduated? Is it a temporary? At what point do you say we're withholding all authorizer fee? But I do agree that, we also recognize that the authorizer fee are resources dedicated to quality authorizing. And so I don't think that I think we want, from a philosophical perspective, for that to be the means of last resort, but to really be supporting authorizer quality before we actually get there, because we know that's potentially cutting off a source to support them in getting better quality authorizing.
Okay. And on the corrective action plans, is there a kind of a standard template for that? And I'm assuming that there'll be kind of measurable items in there for set up to be achieved.
Sure. We haven't gotten that far yet in the process, but Dave, do you have any templates here?
Yeah, there are templates from Ohio for sure. All of this aims to align with the evaluation tool that's used on a biannual basis. So we'll talk about it in the next couple of questions, but to align annual reporting with that tool, so the off-year. So my logical way to go with that is to kind of reinforce the evaluation process and have them submit corrective action responses consistent with the frame that the evaluation process looks at. So submission of documentation on a certain timeline in order to notice
Okay. Thank you.
So as many of our intervention options include something involving the annual report, I want to move to that next topic here so we can continue that conversation since it is pretty well aligned. So thinking about the authorizer's annual report, each year authorizers are required to submit a summary report on the status of their charter schools, which is submitted to the department by January 1st each year. So relative to our interventions discussion, we'd like to incorporate some of the interventions into the annual report since this is a structure that's already in place. And so for authorizers evaluated within a given year, their evaluation would be incorporated into their annual report. And then for authorizers who are on that off-year evaluation, and a self-assessment would be incorporated into the annual report using a form that looks like this one here, this narrative form. So this is actually coming from the evaluation tool itself, in which authorizers will complete a self-evaluation on each standard as part of their documentation submission. So we would use this same tool or the same form as the self-assessment tool for the authorizers to complete in their off year as well. So thinking about that, our question here is, should authorizers identify updated documentation or self-assess on standards in which they're rated 0 only or for 0 and 1 rating? I want to open it up to you all to discuss here. Or we think this idea is amazing and we will support.
This coordinate, I guess, it just would seem logical that you would want that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see why would you not do that.
There. Okay, great. Yeah.
Right, that exact same thing, like yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense then.
Having a hard time poking a hole in that.
Well, we're doing a good job then, I guess. Okay, I'll move us into our third topic here. This is around technical assistance. So as we were discussing earlier, we're considering that we intend to request this self-assessment and to update and an update on a response to the evaluation feedback during those off years. We also want to consider whether or what our state board staff's response should be to authorizers when they revise or are newly creating documentation during that off year. We know that we want to hold authorizers accountable, and we also want the evaluations to provide authorizers an opportunity for growth and ongoing learning, as we were talking about earlier. So we recognize that based on conversations with Dave about experiences in other states, it's common to engage in support conversations and to make informal recommendations. However, we do not want to create a situation where a recommendation from the state board leads to poor practice or for the board to be accused of overstepping authority. So our question here is whether we should provide support to authorizers that includes informal recommendations, or if we should really avoid these completely in the future. So in other words, to what extent are we providing feedback and support outside of the evaluation cycle, and is this our role?
Yeah, to me, I could be wrong. I'm still learning. Yeah, I think you got to have clarity of, are you the authorizer or the consultant? And I think that's where, like you said, you don't want someone to take a recommendation, or especially an informal recommendation, and then have that turn around and say, well, we just did what we said. And is that what I'm reading here? Is how to create clarity of boundary and role between the board and the schools or the districts?
Yes, exactly. And Dave, you know a bit more about some of these pros and cons here from other states' experiences. Anything you want to add on?
Yeah, just kind of two perspectives on this. So state board staff, state board itself are developing great expertise and acute knowledge of high quality authorizing. So an authorizer gets evaluated, doesn't quite get what the standard is, and is trying to figure out what type of documentation expectations will help them get to better quality. Like Tess and Allie may know the answer and may be able to point them to the right source with things. Now, if you liken it to actually the relationship of an authorizer with a charter school, I always work with authorizers to help them make this distinction. Let's just say there's an instructional practice to work with ELs, and the authorizer is holding the school accountable because they aren't serving ELs effectively, and they say, oh, you should really think about implementing this instructional strategy. Well, 3 years later when they get to renewal, and the school is not achieving or hasn't even made or has regression in terms of serving ELs, the school can say, oh, well, we just implemented what you said, and still we haven't achieved, so you can't hold us accountable to that standard. So, walking that line on being experts, Tess and Allie, and others in your office who are those experts, but keeping the responsibility and the autonomy and the decision-making of what it is that they implement on the shoulders of the authorizer is a real struggle. And I suggested that we have this as a question so you all can kind of chew on this, so you can be deliberate and not be surprised if an authorizer starts to express that they're just implementing, your words, what you said they should. So it's good to be proactive to think through what position the board will take and how they can recommend and support that with the staff.
Well, to me, I would tend to lean on the side of not being operational board, but be governing, in those two terms, in the sense that if there is a performance rubric, there is an evaluation system, then at those set times, they have the rubric in front of them, which is what is the expectation. And I think part of the point of this, especially in a charter school or within authorizers, is they're supposed to be the experts at the local levels on best practice. And if they're not, then that's a problem, but I would say I would lean towards the creating clarity of our role to engage along the way or outside of the formal times that we are supposed to be involved. And that there's a real clear process in that of here are the expectations built out in this, I'm using the word rubric for lack of a better term, and here are the standards of expectation. You have those clearly before you, as you're going, and you can self-evaluate along the way. And then when it comes in, we have the formal approach, not the informal along the way. That's where I tend to lean. I think the other way gets a lot messier.
Yeah, that strikes me as wise. To the degree I have any hesitation in my voice, it's just because my soul is always leaning towards helping anyone who asks for help. And so I don't know how to reconcile. If this would never happen. But let's just first, in my play world, like this could happen. Like, you know, someone in the district, because, right, it's a small town. Like, I know a lot of people. They know, you know, they reach out and they're like, oh, Lisa, you're on the state board. You know, one or two things about this. Like, could you help us think it through? Like, the idea of me saying no to that is almost unthinkable. I would help them because, right, like, it's kids. Right. And so, like, why wouldn't I help them? And so, you know, now, granted, I'd probably do it and say, hey, listen, this is just advice. This is informal. These are some of the things I would think about. I mean, I think I would try to be wise myself about how I sort of frame my assistance, and that it's not directives by any means. It's just like, you might want to consider this. You might want to consider this. You guys got to own it, ultimately. But sure, right. I'm happy to offer advice. Like something like that, it's hard for me to fathom, like.
Not doing it.
Not doing it, yeah. And at the same time, I think, Nate, you're wise because we are a governing body. Like I'm obsessed with operational excellence, as everyone on this call knows. It's not like I want to be in a business, though, of actually managing the ops. It's mostly like, how do you drive like and develop systems that help all of our schools and authorizers be successful operationally. And so I get it, like, meaning, yeah, I mean, Nate, I'm sure, like policy-wise and tactically speaking, correct.
Doesn't feel good, though. Well, here's a question. This is just a thought. I mean, a lot of this sounds like formative versus summative assessment.
Yeah.
And if there is clarity created around the, you know, I'm going to use educational term here, but learning of the school or learning of the district, like this is feedback for their learning, not for evaluation, or this is consultation in a sense that is not evaluative, and then the other side of it being evaluative. I mean, if I'm trying to think about Elisa's comments and then what I just said, I mean, there is potentially a middle ground, but it just takes more work in creating what are the clarities in the middle ground. I mean, you know, you don't want the pendulum to swing too far where we can't collaborate in education, but at the same time, I don't think the board can get involved in operations.
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess I was just trying to think, practically speaking, are we really talking about what you and the staff would be doing? Because I can't honestly see the board members being directly involved here.
Yeah.
How would you see that playing out?
Yes, Gordon, it would absolutely be more between the staff and the authorizer.
And I think an example of this might be, and this is Tess, you know, let's say that we see an authorizer really struggling on intervention protocols. You know, I think Allie and I have been in this work long enough that we know some really great authorizers that have a variety of intervention protocols. I think in my, like, wanting to support people, I mean, a part of me would like to say, you know, here are 3 authorizers' intervention protocols you just might want to take a look at as you're thinking about developing your own, and really connecting people to resources. Because I do think that, you know, what we know in the authorizing field is that it is a very specialized expertise, and there are very good authorizers out there that have great resources, and I think there are some authorizers that really do need access to additional resources. So I think as we think through this, really providing, I appreciate Nate's comment around providing that clarity of roles, but I do want to make sure that we are seen as someone who people can turn to and be, you know, a thought partner where we can, but really make sure that we're drawing those clear lines.
If I can offer just kind of one middle of the road, I mean, because we frame this in terms of a dichotomy, right? Do you do this or not do this? And so if you go back to the relationship between an authorizer and a charter school, some authorizers, when faced with the same challenge, satisfy it in terms of convening folks on an annual basis, like they convene their charter schools on an annual basis for a conference, a meeting, convening, or whatever they call it, and present high quality or exemplars that they have seen over the course of the year. So they point to the other schools in their portfolio and try to facilitate networking and shine a light. In the case that Tess is sharing, you know, if there's an absence of hypothetically intervention protocols, like bring in something or make reference to NACSA, the National Association, rather than saying like, this is what we suggest. It's like, here's the resource, this is what nationally they do. So that might be the one way to satisfy this, is to kind of organize and formalize it on an annual or biannual basis and use the results from the evaluation actually to feed the content, right? So if somebody has a really solid, highly rated renewal process, then they're going to be asked to present that information and share out, and then you'll just close the loop between the low performers in that area and the high performers.
That makes sense to me.
Thanks, Dave. Great conversation here. I think we're all kind of having similar conversations as well as what you all are thinking today, and how we can be supportive and how we can really link authorizers to one another through this process, so that we're not necessarily telling everyone exactly what to do, but sharing resources and best practices. It seems like the smart thing to do here. So thank you for your input on that. And before we transition to our final conversation here on the Charter School Commission, any last questions, comments about authorizer evaluations?
I have none. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to turn it back over to Tess to talk about our transition to the commission. Thank you all, and I appreciate Allie and particularly Dave for joining the call today. Schoolworks has been a true partner with us in this work, and we just really appreciate y'all's support as we are working through this in the last 6 to 9 months, and also moving forward into our pilot evaluation process. So the last thing that we have, thanks Dave, the last thing we have on our agenda today is just to give you all a brief update of how the stand-up of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission is going, and the support that both Tennessee Department of Education and the State Board has been providing to the commission. So the commission members have been appointed by the governor and are currently going through the confirmation process. They had their first organizing session in February 18th and 19th. And prior to coming together in person for the first time, on January 30th, the State Board of Education provided a webinar where we walk through the history of the State Board as it relates to charter school appeals and charter school authorizing, the overall portfolio of the State Board schools, and to give in a slightly more detail kind of the roles and responsibilities that the commission will be taking over, both in terms of the appeals that we hear, as well as the LEA roles and responsibilities that the commission will be taking on. At the organizing session, it was 2 full days, and both Angie Sanders, the State Board General Counsel, and myself, along with members of the Department of Education, supported the commission members on site. They elected their chair and vice chair and adopted key policies that are going to govern their work. Our colleague Nathan James worked with the commission to get those processes in place. They also received several presentations from members of the department and the State Board. So Angie presented on open meetings, open records, rulemaking. I presented on the charter school portfolio, and they also had a presentation from Dr. Eve Carney on school turnaround plans. The commission spent about half a day with a consultant from WestEd, Dr. Steve Canavero, who was the former superintendent of education in Nevada, as well as the former executive director of their charter school commission. And they were able to get some national perspective on being a statewide entity in charter school authorizing, as well as to begin the training on quality authorizing standards.
So in terms of next steps, we are continuing to partner with the Department of Education in supporting the stand-up of the commission. The commission members decided to go through a search firm in order to find and hire their executive director. I think the tentative timeline that the commission discussed was looking at a late summer 2020 hire for that executive director, who will then be charged with filling out their staff. So understanding that there will not be, full-time staff members in place for the commission, we are still continuing to support them on their committee work as well as their upcoming meetings. So their next full commission meeting is April the 22nd. They do have established some subcommittees similar to the state board, and I do envision that those are going to be meeting, in between their full commission meetings to get some of their work done. For example, they need to establish a location, find an office, determine what that rent's going to be, review some of the state board's rules and policies on charter school appeals, public records, to determine what they need to tweak or adopt in order to begin that rule promulgation process that you all are very familiar with. We are really excited about the opportunity for commission members to reach out to their the state board members that are either in their districts or doing work around them. One of the things that we heard from commission members during the commission meetings was a desire to get to know the state board members who've been doing this work for a longer period of time, so they can really understand you all's perspective. So I did want to give you a heads up that in the coming months, we are going to be connecting commission members to you all offline, and would really encourage you all to make yourself available to provide them your perspective and expertise on this work. And that's all that I have on the commission stand-up update. Are there any questions that you all have for me or the rest of the group?
I have none.
I do not.
Well, I appreciate the way that all the information was pulled together, and the backup slides that were kind of hidden for today's presentation.
Great. Well,
Yeah, there's really good information going into this.
Fabulous. Well, I'm glad, and please kudos to Elisa for pushing us in the direction of really getting pre-reads out there and using our time for discussion. I feel like this is a really great subcommittee meeting. I hope that we're able to use this format in other platforms moving forward. Certainly, we can do this in our future subcommittee meetings here. Elisa, anything else from your end before we wrap up and give everybody 30 more minutes in their day?
Sure. Thank you. So I want to echo what Nate and Gordon outlined. I mean, this is just an outstanding set of prep work, very clear what the questions were, clear what the information that would help us answer the questions. I mean, all of it was very well constructed, and I know, these decks take a lot of time, having produced a lot in my lifetime, so thank you, Tess and Allie and team, for, doing the proper prep work in order for us to have a productive conversation. I agree with you, Tess. It was highly productive. I was personally deeply very engaged in these issues. I think it's the right level of engagement that we should be operating at. So thank you. And that's all I have. I mean, Nate, Gordon, thank you so much for spending time on a Friday morning on the committee work. And yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing the work together. And that's all I have. I hope everyone has a fabulous weekend.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.